The cartwheels cracked against cobblestones, each jolt sending pain through her bound wrists. October 16th, 1793. Paris was drunk on blood, and Marie Antoinette was the main course. But the guillotine waiting in the Place de la Révolution was merely the finale. The real torture had started months ago, designed not just to kill a queen, but to destroy the very idea of one. She sat exposed in an open tumbrel, a garbage cart for common criminals. No cushions, no dignity. Just rough wood pressing into her flesh, while 30,000 voices howled for her head. Her hair, once tower-high and powdered white, had been hacked short with sheep shears that morning. Not for convenience, for humiliation. Every strand that fell was a piece of royalty, hitting the floor. The executioner's assistant had grabbed fistfuls, sawing through with dull blades while guards watched and laughed. They wanted her to look like a mad woman. Mission accomplished. The white cap they forced on her head wasn't mercy. It was mockery. The same cap prostitutes wore to their executions. The message screamed louder than any crowd. This wasn't just regicide, it was degradation, engineered to perfection. 4 months earlier, she'd watched from her cell window as they dragged her husband to his death. Louis XVI got a closed carriage, a confessor, dignity in his final hours. Marie Antoinette got none of that. They saved special cruelties for her. The conciergerie prison had become her tomb, long before any blade fell. Cell number 280, 11 feet by 6. Damp stone walls that wept moisture day and night. One straw mattress crawling with lice. A screen for privacy that didn't work because guards had orders to watch her every movement. Even using the chamber pot became a public act. They called it security. She called it what it was: systematic humiliation of a woman they'd already decided to kill. But the physical degradation was just the appetizer. The real feast of cruelty came wrapped in legal documents. The trial of Marie Antoinette wasn't about justice. It was about creating a monster worthy of public execution. Prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville didn't just want her dead. He wanted her destroyed in the court of public opinion first. The charges started predictable. Conspiracy with foreign powers, depleting the national treasury, sending millions to her brother, the Austrian emperor. Some of it was even true. She had conspired. She had written letters begging for invasion. But truth wasn't enough for the bloodthirsty convention. They needed depravity, so they manufactured it. The most vicious accusation came from her own son. 8-year-old Louis Charles, imprisoned and brainwashed by his jailers, signed a statement claiming his mother had sexually abused him. The boy who once clung to her skirts now provided testimony that she had, quote, taught him self-pollution and performed acts that decency prevents me from describing. The courtroom gasped. Even hardened revolutionaries shifted uncomfortably. When pressed to respond, Marie Antoinette stood silent for a moment, then spoke with a dignity that momentarily silenced her tormentors. I appeal to all mothers present. Is such a crime even possible? The crowd stirred. For a heartbeat, sympathy flickered. Prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville saw it and panicked. He quickly moved on, but the damage was done. Not to the prosecution, they had already decided her fate. The damage was to whatever remained of revolutionary justice. They had stooped so low that even their supporters felt the mud on their faces. Still, the show trial ground forward. Witnesses appeared like actors in a carefully rehearsed play. Her former chambermaid testified about extravagant spending. A wig maker claimed she ordered new hair pieces while peasants starved. Each testimony was crafted to paint her not just as a traitor, but as a symbol of every excess that had driven France to revolution. They called her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, not Marie Antoinette, not the former queen, just a foreign parasite who had gorged herself on French blood. Her defence lawyer, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, had less than 1 day to prepare. He'd never met her before the trial. The court gave him no access to documents, no time to find witnesses, no chance to build anything resembling a case. He did what he could, pointing out the obvious lies, The lack of evidence, the hysteria masquerading as justice. The jury pretended to listen. They'd made their decision before entering the room. The physical toll showed on her body like a map of suffering. At 37, she looked 60. Her hair had turned white during her imprisonment. Not gradually the way age paints silver threads through dark locks. It happened in weeks, stress bleaching her like winter snow. Blood stained her dress constantly now. What her jailers mockingly called her monthly flowers had become a hemorrhage that wouldn't stop. The revolution had even turned her own body against her. They gave her no clean clothes, no rags, no dignity in her suffering. She tore strips from her dress, trying to maintain some pretense of cleanliness while guards smirked and made crude jokes. The fever came next. Chills that made her shake until her teeth chattered, followed by sweats that soaked through her thin dress. The prison doctor, a revolutionary appointee, diagnosed her with hysteria common to her sex and prescribed nothing. Medicine was for citizens, not Austrian whores. That's what the guards called her to her face now. Not Your Majesty, not even Widow Capet, the name they'd assigned her after killing her husband. Just variations of whore, each one designed to chip away another piece of her humanity. Sleep became impossible, not just from the straw scratching her skin or the cold seeping through stone walls. They made sure of that. Guards changed shifts with maximum noise. Doors slammed, keys rattled, conversations held at full volume directly outside her cell. When she dozed, they'd bang on the bars. "Making sure the Austrian bitch hasn't escaped," they'd laugh. As if she could, as if there was anywhere to go in a France that had gone mad with blood. The night before her execution, they played their cruelest game yet. 2 priests arrived at her cell, not to offer comfort, but to break her. The constitutional clergy, those who'd sworn loyalty to the revolution over Rome, came with honeyed words and poisoned promises. "Confess your crimes against the people," they urged. "Acknowledge the justice of your sentence. Die as a true daughter of France, not an Austrian serpent." She refused. They persisted for hours, tag-teaming their assault on her faith. One would quote scripture, while the other twisted it into revolutionary propaganda. When she asked for a non-juring priest, one who'd stayed loyal to Rome, they laughed. "Those traitors fled or died. You'll take our sacraments or burn in hell with your Habsburg ancestors." She took neither. As dawn broke on October 16th, she scratched a final letter to her sister-in-law, Elizabeth. The guards would never deliver it. They'd find it later, stuffed in a crack in the wall, each word a testament to the dignity they couldn't destroy. "I am calm," she wrote, as people are when their conscience is clear. The ink was made from soot mixed with her own saliva. They'd taken her writing materials weeks ago. Even her last words had to be stolen from the ash in spite of her captors. At 5 a.m, the executioner arrived. Charles-Henri Sanson wasn't cruel by nature. He'd killed her husband with professional efficiency, even showing kindness in those final moments. But his assistants were different. Young men drunk on revolutionary fervour and cheap wine, they saw this as their moment of glory. One grabbed her arms, wrenching them behind her back with unnecessary force. Another cut away her white cap, exposing the butchered hair beneath. "Like shearing a sheep," he announced to his companions, "though sheep smell better." The rope bit deep into her wrists. Unlike her husband, who'd had his hands bound loosely in front, they wrenched hers behind until her shoulders screamed. The position forced her chest forward, ensuring that every bounce of the tumbril would be visible to the crowd. They knew exactly what they were doing. Even her body would be made to perform for the mob. When she winced at the pain, Sanson himself intervened. "Courage, madame," he whispered. It was the first kind word she'd heard in months. She straightened her spine and nodded. If they wanted a show, she'd give them one, but not the one they expected. The dress she wore told its own story of degradation. Once white, it was now grey with grime and rust red with blood. They'd offered her nothing else, forcing the former Queen of France to meet her death in rags that a beggar would refuse. Her shoes had holes that let in the October cold. No stockings, no undergarments they deemed proper. Just thin fabric clinging to her body, ravaged by imprisonment and disease. The crowd would later claim she looked haggard, broken, defeated. They saw what the revolution wanted them to see. They missed the way she held her head, the steady gaze that looked through her tormentors as if they were mist. The tumbril lurched into motion and Paris exploded. 30,000 voices rose as one, a wall of sound that should have shattered her composure. Death to the Austrian, death to the whore, death to the she-wolf. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. Women who'd once curtsied to her now spat as she passed. Someone threw a rotten apple that splattered against the cart's side. The guards didn't stop them. Why would they? This was justice, revolutionary style. But then something unexpected happened. As the cart turned onto the Rue Saint-Honoré, a young woman pushed through the crowd. She wore the tricolour cockade like everyone else, played the part of a good revolutionary citizen. But as the tumbril passed, she dropped to her knees. Others saw it too. Here and there, amid the screaming mob, people fell silent. Some turned away. Others watched with something that looked dangerously like sympathy. The guards noticed and began pushing harder, swinging rifle butts at anyone who wasn't cheering loud enough. At the corner of Rue de la Paix, the crowd pressed so close that the cart had to stop. This wasn't planned. For a moment, Marie Antoinette sat perfectly still while hatred seethed around her like a living thing. A man climbed onto the wheel, his face inches from hers. "Any last words for the people you robbed, Austrian bitch?" She looked at him with those grey eyes that had once commanded courtiers. "I robbed no one," she said clearly, "but I forgive you for believing I did." The man recoiled as if slapped. He slunk back into the crowd while guards frantically whipped the horses forward. The artist Jacques-Louis David sat sketching from a window, overlooking the route. A rabid revolutionary, he'd voted for the king's death and cheered for the queen's, but his drawing that day captured something he probably didn't intend. Not a broken woman heading to deserved punishment, but a human being maintaining dignity while civilization collapsed around her. Years later, that sketch would haunt him. The revolution had many artists. It didn't need him to document its cruelties with such inadvertent honesty. As they neared the Place de la Révolution, the crowd's bloodlust reached fever pitch. Someone had started a chant. Marie Antoinette à la lanterne, referencing the lampposts where aristocrats had been hung in the early days. Others sang revolutionary songs, with verses specially written for the occasion, each more obscene than the last. Street vendors sold programs listing her crimes. Prostitutes offered themselves to guards in celebration of the Austrian whore's death. Paris had transformed into a carnival of cruelty. The scaffold loomed ahead, painted red to hide the bloodstains. They'd learned that from experience. Fresh wood showed every death, turned black with gore after just a few executions. Red paint solved that problem. It also sent a message. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a celebration dipped in crimson. The guillotine itself stood like a sovereign of its own making. They called it the National Razor, Madame Guillotine, the Patriotic Shortener. Pet names for a killing machine. The blade had been sharpened that morning, tested on bales of straw to ensure a clean cut. They wanted efficiency, not mercy. But efficiency could be its own small mercy when the alternative was botched butchery. The crowd around the scaffold was different from the street mob. These were the connoisseurs of death, the regulars who attended every execution. The tricotiases, those ghoulish women who knitted while heads rolled, had claimed their usual spots. They'd started a scarf in royal blue that morning, planning to switch to red thread at the moment of death. Symbolic artistry for the revolutionary age. The vendors here sold different wares, miniature guillotines for children, cockades dipped in what they claimed was aristocratic blood. programs listing not just today's victim, but scheduling upcoming attractions. Death had become Paris's favourite entertainment. And business was booming. The tumbrel stopped 20 feet from the scaffold, close enough for her to see the grooves in the wood where thousands of necks had rested, close enough to smell the vinegar they used to mask the stench of blood, close enough to hear the curiosities debating whether she'd faint or face death with aristocratic arrogance. They had bets running. 5 assignats said she'd beg. 10 said she'd faint. 20 said she'd die silent. The house always won in the end. Sanson's assistants pulled her from the cart with practiced roughness. Her legs, numb from sitting, buckled. For one moment she stumbled, and the crowd erupted. The Austrian falls, already kneeling to the Republic. But she caught herself straightening despite the rope-cutting circulation to her hands. That small recovery sparked rage in those who'd wanted to see her crawl. Someone screamed, "Pride goes before the fall!" Another shouted back, "And her fall's about 30 pounds of steel." The steps to the scaffold were deliberately steep. 21 of them, painted that same obscene red. They'd learned that exhausted prisoners moved slower, gave the crowd more time to savour the approach. Marie Antoinette took them one at a time, each footfall measured. Halfway up, she stepped on someone's foot. The man yelped. She turned, and for one surreal moment, court etiquette reasserted itself. "Monsieur, I beg your pardon. I did not mean to hurt you." The executioner's assistant stood frozen. No one had ever apologised to him, especially not while walking to their death. At the top of the scaffold, they positioned her facing the crowd. Standard procedure demanded the condemned address the people. Some begged forgiveness, others proclaimed innocence. The defiant shouted support for the monarchy. Most said nothing, terror stealing their words. Marie Antoinette looked out over the sea of faces. 30,000 people waiting for her to break. She opened her mouth and everyone leaned forward. "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me," she said, voice carrying despite its quietness. "I pardon those who occasioned my death, and pray to God that the blood you shed may never fall upon France." A curse disguised as forgiveness. The crowd heard it and roared disapproval. But Fouquier-Tinville, watching from his privileged position, felt ice down his spine. Those words would be printed in tomorrow's revolutionary papers as evidence of her unrepentant evil, but they'd also be whispered in marketplaces, repeated in salons, remembered long after the revolution devoured itself. He'd wanted her last words to damn her. Instead, she damned them all. The executioners moved fast now, sensing the crowd's ugly mood. They forced her to her knees on the plank, its wood worn smooth by countless victims. The lunette, that wooden collar that held the neck in place, smelled of sweat and fear despite the vinegar wash. As they pushed her head down, her butchered hair fell forward. Someone in the crowd laughed. "Look, the Austrian wig finally falls off." Others took up the cry, not understanding or caring that this was her real hair, whitened by 9 months of calculated torture. Sanson checked the mechanism one final time. The blade weighed 40 kilograms, sharpened to surgical perfection. It would fall from a height of 14 feet, reaching a speed that would separate head from body in less than a second. Quick, clean, merciful compared to the axes and swords of old. The revolution prided itself on such modern efficiency. Death democratized, industrialized, perfected. Every citizen equal before the national razor. But first came the drums, the rolling thunder designed to drown out last words, prayers, or screams. It started low, building to crescendo. The crowd joined in, stamping feet, clapping hands, creating a rhythm that shook the scaffold. The tricotius's needles clicked in time. Street children banged pots stolen from abandoned aristocratic kitchens. All of Paris became a percussion section for death's grand symphony. Through it all, Marie Antoinette remained still. Those close enough to see would later swear she was praying. Her lips moved in what might have been Latin, might have been French, might have been simple silence. The drums made it impossible to know. That was the point. The revolution would let no saint die with audible last prayers. God himself would have to read lips to hear the condemned. The signal came. A red flag raised high. The crowd inhaled collectively, 30,000 breaths held in anticipation. Time stretched like molten glass. The curiosities paused mid-stitch. The vendors stopped hawking their wares. Even the October wind seemed to hold its breath. This was it. The moment they'd howled for, schemed for, killed for. The Austrian whore finally brought low. The symbol of everything they hated about to be literally cut down to size. The blade released. For a heartbeat it hung in the air. Sunlight catching its edge in a line of silver fire. Then gravity took hold. 40 kilograms of angled steel racing toward flesh at 30 feet per second. The crowd tracked its descent with hungry eyes. Some pushed forward, hoping to be baptized in royal blood. Others raised children higher, ensuring they'd remember this glorious day when France freed itself from one more parasite. Impact. The sound was distinctive, not the clean chop of an axe in wood, but something wetter, meatier. The blade passed through flesh, cartilage, and bone without slowing. One moment Marie Antoinette existed, the next she was divided. The head fell into the waiting basket with a soft thud that somehow carried over the crowd's roar. Blood fountained briefly, painting the scaffold's red paint redder still. Her body, released from tension, slumped forward like a puppet with severed strings. Sanson's assistant grabbed the head by its butchered hair, lifting it high for all to see. Standard procedure. Proof of death. Trophy of justice. The eyes were closed. The face slack. Blood dripped from the severed neck, each drop catching sunlight like liquid rubies. The crowd exploded. Hats flew. Women fainted or pretended to. Men who'd never met her claimed vindication for personal grievances. Children would remember this moment decades later, telling grandchildren how they'd seen tyranny's head separated from its body. But something was wrong with the celebration. It peaked too quickly, burned too bright, then faltered. The expected catharsis didn't come. Killing Louis had felt like breaking chains. This felt different, smaller, meaner. The crowd began to disperse almost immediately, their bloodlust satisfied but not sated. The curiosities resumed knitting, red thread now, but their chatter was subdued. The vendors counted their coins with less enthusiasm than usual. Even the October sun seemed dimmer, as if ashamed to witness what Paris had become. The head went into a wicker basket, just another skull among dozens that week, but the body received special treatment. They left it on the scaffold for a full hour, blood pooling and congealing in the October air. Standard executions got 15 minutes of display. Marie Antoinette got 4 times that. Orders from the Committee of Public Safety. Even in death, she would serve the revolution's purposes. Flies gathered, the October sun climbed higher. The blood turned from bright red to rust brown, crackling at the edges like old paint. Young men from the crowd climbed the scaffold, dipping handkerchiefs in the blood. Revolutionary relics to show sweethearts, to prove their patriotic fervour, to sell in the markets later. One entrepreneur had brought small vials, filling them carefully while guards looked the other way. Authentic Austrian blood, he'd cry tomorrow. Only 5 assignats. Prove your loyalty to the Republic. The guards didn't stop him. Why would they? The dead had no rights, no dignity, no protection from commerce. When they finally moved the body, they did so with calculated disrespect. No coffin waited, just an open cart, the same type used to haul animal carcasses from the slaughterhouses. They threw the body in face down, legs splayed, dress riding up to expose flesh that proper society would have died rather than display. The head landed beside it with a wet thump. Someone had tied a rope around the neck stump, letting it drag behind the cart for the first few yards until Sanson himself intervened. Even he had limits. The route to Magdalen Cemetery wound through the market districts. Not an accident. Nothing was accidental anymore. Fishmongers paused their work to gawk. Butchers made jokes about finally seeing royal meat properly displayed. Children threw stones that bounced off the cart's wooden sides. One caught the head, making it roll. The crowd cheered like it was a carnival game. The driver, drunk on wine and revolutionary fervour, deliberately hit every pothole, making the body bounce and shift in obscene positions. At the cemetery gates, a new degradation waited. The gravediggers had been celebrating since dawn. Passing bottles of cheap wine and singing revolutionary songs, they dug the pit the night before. Not a grave, but a hole, barely deep enough to discourage dogs. Quicklime waited in buckets. Not for sanitation, though they'd claim that. Quicklime dissolved flesh, erased identity, ensured that no royalist pilgrim could ever find relics to venerate. Even her bones would be denied posterity. They dumped the body without ceremony. It tumbled into the pit with a graceless thud, limbs akimbo like a broken doll. The head followed, rolling to rest face up. For a moment the gravediggers paused. In death, with eyes closed and face finely relaxed, she looked younger, almost peaceful. One man crossed himself before catching his companion's glare. Revolutionary gravediggers didn't make Catholic gestures. He spat into the pit in the net, proving his loyalty with saliva. The quicklime came next, bucket after bucket of white powder that hissed when it hit blood and flesh. The chemical reaction released heat and stench, a sulphurous cloud that made even the hardened gravedigger step back. They'd done this before with aristocratic corpses, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the powder settled on her face, like a mockery of the cosmetic she'd once worn. Maybe it was how quickly it began its work, flesh already bubbling and dissolving at the edges. "Should we say something?" the younger gravedigger asked. His older companion laughed. "What? A prayer for the Austrian whore? You want to join her?" They filled the hole in silence after that. Not with dirt, but with more lime, with garbage from the cemetery grounds. With the accumulated filth of 1,000 previous burials. No marker, no record. Just another patch of disturbed earth in a cemetery full of them. The revolution had promised to erase the old order. Here was that promise kept in the most literal way possible. Back in the city, the celebration continued with forced enthusiasm. Wine flowed in the taverns, paid for by the committee's agents, to ensure proper revolutionary joy. Street theatres performed crude plays depicting the execution, with prostitutes dressed as Marie Antoinette dying a dozen times for cheering crowds. Artists sketched pornographic cartoons showing her in hell, tortured by demons wearing liberty caps. The printing presses ran all night, churning out pamphlets that mixed truth, lies, and propaganda into a toxic brew that Paris would drink for years. But in the conciergerie, something strange was happening. The guards cleaning out cell 280 found things they hadn't expected. Hidden in cracks or stuff behind loose stones, scratched into the walls. Evidence of a woman who'd refused to break. The letter to Elizabeth they'd never let her send. Threads pulled from her dress and woven into what might have been a rosary. Tally marks counting not days, but what appeared to be prayers. Thousands of them. A spiritual fortress built in secret against their daily assaults. One guard pocketed the letter, planning to sell it. By evening, he'd changed his mind and burned it instead. Something about those words, written in soot and spit by a woman heading to death, unsettled him. "I forgive my children's assassins." She'd written about the nephew who'd accused her of incest. The guard had children. The thought of forgiving their killers made his hands shake. Better to burn such dangerous mercy before it infected him. The cell's walls told their own story. Scratches that might have been calendar marks revealed 9 months of systematic torture. Water stains showed where the roof leaked, right over where her straw mattress had been. No accident. They'd moved her there deliberately during the rainy season. Bloodstains on the floor mapped out her body's rebellion, the hemorrhaging that had turned her monthly cycles into constant agony. Even the stones had been witnesses to cruelty. They whitewashed everything that night. Direct orders from Fouquier-Tinville. No shrines, no relics, no pilgrimages. The cell would house another prisoner tomorrow, and another after that. The revolution's machinery couldn't pause for sentiment. But the guards who did the work noticed something odd. The whitewash wouldn't stick to certain spots. It beaded and ran like tears, leaving shadows of words and marks beneath. They applied 3 coats. The shadows remained. By midnight, Paris had exhausted itself. The taverns emptied. The street theatres closed. The pamphlet sellers counted their profits and went home. In the morning, there would be new enemies to hate, new executions to cheer, new blood to sanctify their glorious revolution. But tonight something felt unfinished. They'd killed the symbol, but not what it symbolised. They destroyed the body, but not the idea. Victory tasted like ash in too many mouths. The newspapers the next morning told different stories than the streets whispered. Official reports described universal joy and patriotic fervour at the Austrians' death. But bakers reported slower sales. Wine merchants noted their cheapest bottles sat untouched. Even the fishwives at Les Halles, those fierce revolutionary women who'd marched on Versailles, seemed subdued. They gutted their fish in unusual silence, as if the familiar ritual of removing organs had taken new meaning. In the convention, deputies who'd voted for her death avoided each other's eyes. Robespierre, that incorruptible architect of terror, spent the morning drafting new laws instead of celebrating yesterday's triumph. He'd gotten what he wanted, the Queen dead, the monarchy's last symbol erased. So why did victory feel like swallowing glass? He wrote faster, pen scratching out decree after decree, more enemies to find, more plots to uncover, more heads to take. Motion was the only cure for doubt. The Tuileries Palace stood empty, its windows reflecting October sky like dead eyes. Looters had long since stripped anything valuable, but now even they avoided it. Guards reported strange sounds at night. Not ghosts. The revolution didn't believe in ghosts, just wind through broken windows, just rats in the walls, just the settling of a building that had housed kings and queens for centuries and now housed only shadows. They doubled the patrols anyway. 3 days after the execution, the first crack appeared. A young soldier who'd stood guard at the scaffold was found in the Seine, pockets weighted with stones. His fellow guards claimed he'd been drinking, talking wild about seeing her head blink after it fell. Nonsense, of course. Reflexes. Everyone knew severed heads showed movement for seconds after separation. But he'd insisted the eyes had opened, had looked directly at him, had seen through to his soul. Suicide was the coward's way out. They buried him without honours. The tricotiases noticed it next. Their usual spot by the scaffold felt different. The red paint looked darker, as if shadows clung to it even at noon. One woman claimed she'd dropped a stitch every time she tried to knit there, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Another said the wood hummed, a low vibration that made her teeth ache. They found new spots, further from the platform. The revolution had no room for superstition, but neither did it require unnecessary discomfort. In the markets, vendors who'd sold execution souvenirs found their goods weren't moving. The vials of Austrian blood sat unsold. The miniature guillotines gathered dust. One merchant tried discounting his wares, only to watch customers actively avoid his stall. He finally threw his entire stock in the river, claiming the items were contaminated with royalist sympathy. His neighbours knew better. They'd seen him counting and recounting coins that seemed to disappear, washing hands that never felt clean. The Committee of Public Safety met in emergency session when reports reached them. Not about ghosts or guilt. Such things didn't exist in the rational republic. But about productivity. Factory workers made mistakes. Soldiers missed drills. Even the most fervent revolutionaries seemed distracted, unfocused, as if waiting for something. Waiting for what? No one could say. The very question was counter-revolutionary. But the waiting continued, a held breath that made all of Paris lightheaded. Children played different games now. Where once they'd pretended to execute aristocrats with stick guillotines, now they stood silent in courtyards. When adults asked what game they were playing, they'd say, "The waiting game," and refuse to elaborate. One mother caught her son building tiny towers of stones, then knocking them down while whispering, "I forgive you." When pressed, he claimed he'd heard it from other children, who'd heard it from others, a chain of whispers with no clear source. The theatres tried to maintain momentum. New plays premiered weekly, each more savage than the last in depicting royal crimes. But audiences grew restless. Actors forgot lines when playing Marie Antoinette. One actress fled the stage mid-performance, claiming she'd felt hands on her throat during the execution scene. Her replacement lasted 2 nights before developing a hemorrhage that stained her costume in patterns too familiar for comfort. They cancelled the play. Public demand, they said. The public hadn't demanded anything. At Madeleine Cemetery, the gravediggers reported problems. The quicklime pit where they dumped her body wouldn't settle. Ground that should have been stable kept sinking, requiring new fill daily. Worse, nothing would grow near it. Grass died in perfect circles expanding outward. Trees dropped leaves out of season. Even weeds avoided the spot. They added more lime. The dead zone spread wider. They stopped adding lime. It spread anyway. One gravedigger quit after claiming he'd seen the earth breathe. "Like lungs," he insisted to anyone who'd listen. "Like it's trying to speak but has no throat." His replacement lasted a week before developing shaking hands that made holding a shovel impossible. The third simply disappeared one night, leaving his tools arranged in a pattern that looked almost like words. No one could read what they might have said. No one tried very hard. The convention passed new laws forbidding counter-revolutionary superstition, but the laws themselves revealed the problem. You don't ban what doesn't exist. You don't punish people for believing in nothing. The very act of denial confirmed the presence of what they denied. More citizens were arrested for spreading royalist ghost stories than for actual royalist activity. The prisons filled with people whose only crime was admitting they couldn't sleep. 2 weeks after the execution, Fouquier Tinville made a decision that shocked even his allies. He ordered Madeleine Cemetery closed. Health concerns, he claimed. Overflow from the quicklime pits. Risk of disease. Nobody believed him. Everyone saw how his hands trembled signing the decree, how his eyes darted to shadows that shouldn't have been there. The cemetery gates were chained. Armed guards posted. Still, people reported lights moving among the graves at night. The guards saw nothing. The guards requested transfers. In her old cell at the conciergerie, 3 prisoners had come and gone. Each lasted less than a week. The first claimed the walls whispered accusations. The second scratched at the whitewash until her fingers bled, insisting something important was hidden beneath. The third simply refused to speak. Spending days staring at marks only she could see, they moved her to another cell. She recovered immediately but refused to say what she'd experienced. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. By winter, the terror had turned cannibal. The blade that took Marie Antoinette's head developed an insatiable appetite. 20, 30, 50 executions a day. The scaffold's red paint turned black with layered blood that no amount of vinegar could clean. Paris reeked of iron and fear. But something had changed after the Queen died. The crowds grew thinner. The cheers rang hollow. Even the trichotiuses began missing executions, claiming arthritis, claiming illness, claiming anything but the truth, that watching heads fall had lost its savour. Fouquier Tinville, the prosecutor who'd orchestrated her trial, worked 18-hour days sending citizens to their deaths. He didn't sleep anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the courtroom, heard her voice asking all mothers if such crimes were possible. He drank wine cut with opium, trying to blur the memory. Instead, it sharpened. Every woman he condemned wore her face for a moment. Every aristocrat spoke with her accent. He prosecuted harder, faster, as if enough blood could wash away the stain of that single question. The revolution began eating its own with particular relish. The Girondins fell first, moderate revolutionaries suddenly deemed enemies of the people. Then the Hébétists, too radical even for radicals. The prison galleries that once held royalists now bulged with yesterday's prosecutors. Men who'd cheered the Queen's death found themselves taking the same tumbrel ride, past the same howling crowds, up the same red steps. The symmetry wasn't lost on them. Neither was the irony. Jacques Hébert himself, who'd written the vilest pamphlets about Marie Antoinette, who'd called her the arch-tigress of Austria, and invented sexual perversions to attribute to her, mounted the scaffold on March 24th, 1794, 5 months after her death. He tried to speak to the crowd to remind them of his revolutionary credentials. The drums drowned him out. As they positioned his head in the lunette, witnesses swore he whispered something that sounded like, "Forgive." The blade fell before he could finish. One by one they all followed. The men who'd judged her, who'd mocked her, who'd engineered her humiliation. Fouquier-Tinville lasted longest, prosecuting until the day he himself was prosecuted. At his trial, someone mentioned Marie Antoinette. He flinched as if slapped. "I was following orders," he said. "We all were." When asked whose orders, he couldn't answer. The revolutions, the people's, histories, the words tangled in his mouth like bloody thread. They condemned him in under an hour. On May 16th, 1795, Fouquier-Tinville rode the tumbrel. The crowd was tiny compared to the Queen's execution. Barely 1,000 souls, and half of those were there by accident. No one sang, no one cheered. The tricotiaces had vanished entirely, their clicking needles replaced by silence. As he climbed the scaffold, those same 21 steps, he counted them aloud. One for each month since her death. Someone heard him mutter. The math was wrong. He didn't seem to care. The blade that took his head was the same that had taken hers. They never changed it, just sharpened and cleaned between killings. By the end, that blade had tasted over 16,000 necks. But gravediggers whispered that Fouquier-Tinville's head fell differently, heavier, as if it carried more weight than mere bone and flesh. When they threw it in the common pit, it sank immediately while others floated. Physics couldn't explain it. Neither could they. The conciergerie became a monument to irony. Cell 280, where Marie Antoinette had suffered, housed a parade of the revolution's architects. Robespierre himself spent his last night there, jaw shattered by a bullet, unable to speak. He lay on the same straw, stared at the same walls, felt the same water dripping from the same leak they'd never fixed. Guards reported he tried to scratch something in the stone but lacked the strength. The marks looked like letters. No one tried to read them. By 1795, exhaustion had replaced enthusiasm. The terror officially ended, not with grand pronouncements but with simple fatigue. Paris had run out of enemies to kill, energy to hate, reasons to cheer. The guillotine stood idle more often than not. Vendors couldn't give away execution souvenirs. The red paint on the scaffold peeled and flaked, revealing wood stained so deep with blood that it looked black in all lights. They talked about tearing it down. They left it standing. Some monuments to shame were necessary. Children born after 1793 grew up strange. They played quietly, avoided the old execution sites, had nightmares about women in white asking questions they couldn't answer. Mothers found them building elaborate towers of blocks, only to knock them down while whispering apologies. When asked why, they'd say they didn't know. It just felt necessary. Like paying a debt inherited before birth. The mothers didn't press, they had their own debts, their own whispered apologies in the dark. The Bourbon Restoration came in 1814, bringing Louis XVIII to the throne. One of his first acts was searching for his sister-in-law's remains. The Madeleine Cemetery had become a construction site. Bodies moved and mixed and lost. They found bones that might have been hers, might have been anyone's. The quicklime had done its work too well. They buried what they found with royal honours in Saint-Denis, but everyone knew the truth. They were burying an idea, not a person. She was gone in ways that made finding her impossible. But Paris remembered in its stones and shadows. The Place de la Révolution became Place de la Concorde, but blood doesn't wash out with new names. The conciergerie opened for tours, celle to Haiti carefully restored to show her suffering. Tourists came expecting to feel triumph or tragedy. Instead, they felt a strange hollowness, as if the cell itself had been emptied of more than its prisoner. Even the walls seemed to lean away from each other, trying to escape their own memories. In 1816, a guard doing routine maintenance in the cell found something the restorers had missed. Behind a loose stone, wrapped in threads that dissolved at a touch, was a single white flower. Not painted or carved, an actual flower, impossibly preserved. It shouldn't have survived a month, let alone 23 years. He showed it to his supervisor, who ordered it destroyed immediately. Revolutionary lies, he called it, though the revolution was long dead. The guard kept it instead, pressing it in his Bible. His granddaughter donated it to a museum in 1889. It still hadn't decayed. The historians came later, trying to make sense of it all. They wrote about politics and economics, about class warfare and social justice. All true, all important, all insufficient. Because what happened to Marie Antoinette wasn't just about ending monarchy or punishing excess. It was about what happens when a civilization decides that cruelty is justice, that suffering is entertainment, that humanity itself is negotiable. She died not just as a queen, but as a warning. This is what we're capable of when we forget that our enemies are human. Today, tourists still visit her cell. They still walk the route of the tumbrel. They still stand where the scaffold stood, now marked by a small plaque most people miss. But the real monument isn't in marble or bronze. It's in the questions that linger like morning mist along the Seine. How did ordinary people become capable of such extraordinary cruelty? When does justice become vengeance? What debts do we inherit from our ancestors' applause? The questions have no easy answers. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the discomfort itself is her legacy, a permanent unease in places that once rang with certainty. She haunts history not as a ghost but as a mirror, showing us what we become when we mistake theatre for justice, when we turn suffering into spectacle, when we forget that every severed head once held dreams, fears, and the simple desire to live another day. Marie Antoinette died on October 16th in 1793. But what they did to her before the guillotine, that lived on, poisoning the revolution from within until it choked on its own cruelty. The blade fell in a second. The consequences echoed for centuries. In the end, she was right. The blood they shed did fall upon France. It fell like rain, like tears, like the weight of history itself. And we're still trying to wash it clean.